I'm going to start this week's episode by talking about film, but don't worry, we will get to the comic at hand shortly. There's just a couple of techniques I want to introduce, and The Shining is a really good way of doing that. It's a film that a lot of you will have probably seen. It's a horror film through and through, but not so the traditional jump scare horror. It's kind of more like a cerebral type, though it is still pant-wettingly scary. And The Shining has a few interesting points when it comes to deciphering the method at which the film makes you feel, for lack of a better term, off. There's a bunch of reasons for this, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but there are two which I really like, and which factor into what I want to talk about with this week's feature comic. They revolve around colour palettes and geography. Some of the best horror places their characters in isolated locations, and of course The Shining is no different. The hotel is alone, up a mountain, and it's off-season, so no guests are around. Such as aliens in space, no one can hear you scream, quote, isolation goes a big way for fear. Like Get Out's opening scene, which has a character walking down an empty street alone at night, there's already a natural sense of fear and apprehension being built into those visuals because we've got someone alone in a new space. And that's not even that removed from reality. And when you keep being reminded of this, it serves to tell your audience that there really is no way out of this situation. This character is trapped. They can't just run away, they have to deal with whatever the bad thing is that's going to be after them as the plot progresses. And what The Shining did particularly well was build a specific geography into the horror as the story played out. We're made very aware from the moment the family goes into the hotel about the location of certain things, almost painfully aware. We get a full tour of the hotel, actually a technique replicated very well in the aforementioned Get Out, and it becomes a whistle-stop tour of places where scary things will happen to these characters later, and it serves to connect all these locales together. It also means, when you're being shown around, there's a natural inclination to ask, what's going to happen here? Which is a clever technique for a horror to get an audience asking questions and working themselves up before anything has even begun to happen. It's something Jordan Peele, the director of Get Out, specifically references in the director's commentary for that film, lifting a page out of Kubrick's book with The Shining and taking time to show off the landscape and how it all physically fits together. And the other thing I mentioned that was interesting is restricted colour palettes. The Shining does do this a lot. There are whole scenes which will be bathed in a particular colour, and it's a way of giving your audience a very specific colour response. Kubrick and production designer Roy Walker often give it almost entirely single colour palettes to scenes. The red bathroom, the green bathroom, the orange patterned flooring, the blue snowy exteriors. It's very full frontal in its approach. The red is dangerous, bloody, exciting, provocative. The green is sickly, disturbing, uneasy. The blue is cold, isolating, lonely. There's almost nothing else from those images, and they all specifically tie into how you should be feeling and reacting to those moments. When you see the woman in the bath with the green walls and the green tub, it's unsettling, which is actually kind of contrasting to the way that the characters in the film see them, but as an audience that's a response forced on us. You're not given the opportunity to feel anything else because of these palettes, it's almost hitting you over the head with mood. And so, finally, after establishing all that, we come to Southern Cross. It's a comic that on the surface may have more in common with something like Alien or Solaris, but it pulls a series of cues from The Shining beyond setting or plot, and I think that's important to take a look at. As an intro, Southern Cross tells the story of Alex Braith as she goes aboard a ship in space to find out what happened to her sister. So you can see the Solaris feel already, and while it's not a horror story per se, it does draw on the language in numerous ways. And let's tackle how it develops the use of isolation first. So similar to The Shining, Southern Cross decides to show us we're in space quite early on, with this big splash showing the ship and the space around it, not entirely dissimilar to the Overlook Hotel's initial opening. It actually gets referenced numerous times, like The Shining, throughout the book. In multiple pages and multiple instances, we're giving windows that look out into nothing but black and stars. There's no way off this ship for Alex. If anything goes bad for her, there's no escape. Again, it's similar to the way that The Shining uses the snow and the exterior of the Overlook Hotel. These characters are just trapped here. And that's one of those horror staples kicking in pretty early. So when Alex is placed in her room, we get a shot of the space out the window on the left side, and our main point of focus is actually all the way across to the right side, which is interesting because most of the detail we need for that scene is on the right. Our character there giving a thoughtful look, and that's where we're really going to need to end up looking, but the caption placement and the left to right eye line means we end up on space first. It's subtle, small, but it is just a reminder of where we are, which is very important for the story and the feel. And that actually comes in the page after we get this shot of Alex looking out the window, her reflection seen in it like a mirror, but almost like she's out there, trapped in space, looking inwards towards the ship. You know, there's so much imagery and theme being built through those moments by this repeated kind of imagery. And it's kept up by very regular pages, such as this double splash. You've got the ship and some panels around it with interaction, but it's again a reminder that the ship is in space, in the middle of nowhere, and the sheer vast size of it. It's not an Alien situation where for the most part everyone ends up together on the ship. This is a city in space. You're going to be alone. That splash comes 4 pages after the previous big splash of the ship in space, which itself comes 3 pages after the last splash. And in between both of those pages, we've got those shots of Alex's bunk with the windows to space, so it's invading a lot of the storytelling. And those splashes are actually some of the very, very few times we get pages like that. It's almost left exclusively for those moments, with the big monolithic looking ship at the centre or near centre of the page. The attention gets pulled towards the ship, and it's designed to give the impression of this overbearing, overpowering thing, which feeds into the futility and fear at the heart of the story. If the ship was rendered in a different way, so smaller or contained in panels, you'd lose the effect of it feeling like it's taking over everything in these pages, just swamping it all. And even when we have a series of pages that take place entirely in the corridors, devoid of any context and linked to the space outside, and we will talk about this page in a second, we're treated to images like this on return, which shows a huge expansive window, black space and light and stars flying past. You know, it can be a tough balancing act because while you don't want to be really obvious and say, hey look, they're in space all the time, you also don't want the reader to forget that the character is trapped in this unfamiliar setting with no way out and no one as a friend. And those exterior shots also look similar for another reason, beyond angle and size choices, because they're very blue, and a lot of the sequences that take place around them aren't. But they're also washed in single tones. We get a shot early on in the first issue that gives us the layout of the ship, and so you can see how we're ticking off a lot of those checks for the classic Shining horror tropes, and it gives various levels of the ship in different colours. So Loughridge, who we've talked about before in a Deadly Class episode, takes a trick from that comic and applies colour themes across entire locations to separate them. So each of the layers here has a different colour to set them apart, while also giving us an idea of geography of the ship. And if you notice which direction the Doctor and Alex are actually heading in, right? It's down. We're layering her under a whole series of floors deep down into the ship, with a flat side-on visual that helps show the simple depth of the area. We can see the stairs going down, see the characters traversing the levels, and it's giving us a sense of distance here too, because this isn't a short conversation and this isn't a short walk. So we know it takes some real time to get down to where Alex is staying. We're building that geography and that sense of being lost and dug underground, buried alive for this character. And that all comes into play again in the final page I want to show you, which we briefly looked at a second ago. Probably one of my favourite pages in all of Southern Cross. Again, we're treated to the same visual treatment of this green-blue wash over a whole page. Nothing escapes that colour, even Alex. It's somewhat suffocating in how restricted that palette ends up being, which is very fitting for the scene. Thanks to the colour of the green-blue, it's sort of a combination of the unsettling green bathroom in The Shining and the cold, isolated blue of the outdoors. It's both of those together. It's cold, it's isolating, and it's kind of scary. And it uses the geography of the ship, and specifically our unfamiliarity with it, which is a trait directly tying into The Shining, to cause confusion. I mentioned earlier the layout of The Shining's Overlook Hotel, which is purposefully designed to be impossible. The office held by the manager has a window that physically just doesn't make sense. The winding corridors that the sun drives his trike around are purposefully confusing and endless, twisting, turning pathways, because it wants to unsettle the viewer. Cloonan and Belanger do the same in this page, which is quite a feat to say they don't have a roaming tracking camera to work with, just a series of 8 static images. So how do they do that? Well, the way they do it is by having Alex change direction in every image, and switch the shot composition and distance every single time. We open with her close, heading towards us, before changing to her being away in the distance heading left, then a mid-shot of her pausing near a window, then a low angle with her walking away from us, then a tighter angle walking left towards us, then a close-up right near the reader looking right, then a mid-walking right before crossing the panel border and finally walking in a direction that seems to make sense to her. And the constant changing of angles mean we as readers don't know whether we're following Alex, or if she's turning around and heading in different directions, or if we're spinning around her. It's just impossible to tell. And much like as The Shining progresses and the hotel starts to get lost in its own map, so does the ship get lost in its own geography. And now we're painfully aware that Alex is floors deep, with nothing around her but an empty ship in space and people that made her sister disappear. And while Southern Cross is not explicitly a horror story, as I said at the top of the episode, the very foundations of its opening are built on exactly the same type of ideas that The Shining, which is explicitly a horror story, is built on. By bringing those elements in, and combining it with the driving plot of the detective noir, Cloonan, Belanger and Loughridge are able to make their story teeter on the edge of horror, which cleverly helps aid the scares, because we're never quite sure just where the moments are going to take us. We're left asking questions, because of the art and colour choices, of being scared or just lost, just confused or being preyed upon. By understanding what makes horror scary, the team is able to adapt it to their detective sci-fi noir, and change the way we respond to that story. As always, imagery is powerful, and by leaning on the tools of the works past, they're able to reconfigure those into a new format, which is a great lesson for any piece of work. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues to exist in this form thanks to the amazing support from people at patreon.com/strippanelnaked. For their pledge, they get access to tons and tons of extra content updated every single week. There's a year's worth on there now, so I'd love it if you take a look and support. If you want to find me on Twitter for more comics talk and analysis, you can. I'm at HassanOE. And finally, hit subscribe to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and we'll see you next time.